Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our this installment of our Lattes and Learnings webinar. So today's presentation is going to be on effective SIEM management, and we'll be going through this with about a 20-minute presentation from Shane Butcher, who's our Senior Solutions and Security Architect, and Jonathan Derby, who's our Chief Information Officer at Ongoing Operations. And feel free as you're going through to ask questions. I can go ahead and act as the moderator and relay those over to John and Shane. If any come up as we're going through, just type those in the question section and I can share those with John and Shane. Also, we'll be doing some polls throughout the presentation, and also there will be time at the end, about 10 to 15 minutes or so, for any questions that you guys all have. So with that, I will turn it over to John to kick us off. And thank you guys all again for joining.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. So just a quick intro. So as Amy mentioned, I'm Jonathan Derby, the CIO at Ongoing Operations, and we also have Shane Butcher, our Senior Solutions and Security Architect and Virtual CISO. Just to give everyone a little background, so we are the leadership of the CISO, or CISO as a Service team from Ongoing Operations. A part of that, we get the opportunity to work with a number of different credit unions as well as a number of different SIEM providers, and have had experience going in and evaluating how SIEMs are configured, deployed at various credit unions, as well as helping out with initial rollouts as well. So we're going to cover a lot of issues today, or a lot of topics around SIEM today. But I'm going to have Amy just poll the audience real quickly and ask how many of you actually have a functioning SIEM, or just we'll say a SIEM in place at your credit union today. We're not reporting on that at a per CU. We're just taking a holistic view as to how many folks in the audience actually have one today. So if we can collect that data real quick, to help us guide a few parts of our conversation.
So right now, John, I'm seeing 80% yes and 20% no.
Great. All right, well, let's move on to the next slide, and I'm going to transition here to Shane Butcher.
Oops, and what did we just have happen there? Let's try that again. All right. So first, let's start off with what is a SIEM, and this is where we're going to get into the boring technical jargon here. But SIEM stands for Security and Information and Event Management. And SIEM has been around for quite a while, but it is essentially the combination of two functionalities that previously existed and some still exist today in certain systems. But the first one is SIEM, SIEM, and that is Security Information Management. And what that system generally does is log collection, analyzation, and reporting on that log data. The other component that it combines would be your Security Event Management. And where this kicks in is when we look at the real-time analysis of the log stream, providing threat monitoring, looking at correlation between the events that are coming in to see what's going on in our whole environment, and alerting us to potential events that are happening. So, what does the SIEM do? What are the core functions of the SIEM? We're looking at log aggregation across all devices, provide reporting on security-based events, so what's happening in our environment, can we go back and look and report on those events, and then alerting, letting us know based on rules that have been configured in the SIEM and correlations as these rules go and look at the data or as it comes in, sending us alerts to let us know proactively that there may be something that we need to investigate in our environment. So why is it important? What is it going to help us do, right? So the first thing is threat detection. If we're sending all of these log streams into this from all of our devices into this single system, and it's able to parse and look at that data, it's going to have a better view of the whole environment, and hopefully with the correct configuration be able to tell us the potential events and threats are happening. It's going to do event correlation for us. So while one event on one server may not be an issue, right? It may just be part of normal operation. If we're now seeing that same event across, 20, 50, 100 devices, we now may be looking at a security incident with someone, trying to penetrate our environment. So these systems are able to see the whole environment and correlate those events. It gives us reduced time to identification for event. Based on some multiple research studies, the average time to detect a data breach is now over 200 days. I'm sure many of you have heard or read some of the reports over the major security breaches, and a lot of those were not discovered for months or even years in some cases. So being able to gather all this data, parse it, and look at it helps us reduce that time to identification for security events. It helps us with incident forensic investigation. If we're sending the log from a couple aspects. First, sending those logs in real time to a central system enables us to have a record of those logs that are not on the systems that may be affected or being compromised, and we may be able to capture that data before a malicious actor is able to delete those logs on the initial system. It also gives us a central place to where we can report based on time frame, device, types of events, to go back and try to replay what happened throughout our environment, not just on a single device. So it helps us with those investigations. And then lastly, compliance reporting. We want to make sure that we're showing that we're monitoring all of our devices. NCUA, is essentially requiring it now for, pretty much all credit unions. All of your standards, frameworks, and best practices, dictate that we should have a SIEM in place. So, with the SIEM in place, we're able to A, prove that we've got it, but B, do compliance reporting to show that we are logging those devices, help show what's in our environment, and produce the reports that we need as a security team and management team, but also to our auditors and examiners. So how are we going to get the most out of our SIEM solution? We've got one. What are we going to do to make sure that we're using it?
All right, and this is where we're going to pull the audience again. Yep. So we had about 80% of the room said, "Yep, we have a SIEM." So I want to, for those that have it, do you think that your SIEM is effectively configured? And if you don't have a SIEM, just hit NA in this.
And we'll go ahead and give everybody a minute to answer that poll. How are the results looking, Amy?
I was going to say, we've got a few coming in, but we are all over the board here. We've got 14% think yes, 29% think no, 14% NA, and 43% maybe.
And I think that's about right. Shane's going to get into the detail, but we walk in and evaluate, how a SIEM is actually configured and deployed, and there's a lot of compromises we make along the way to maybe reduce noise or reduce licensing cost, or maybe we're not updating and reviewing periodically. But we walk in, it's very rare that we walk in and go, wow, boy, is this SIEM really, really configured cleanly, and it's super effective. Most of the time, there's a lot of work to do to get a SIEM doing what you want it to do. So I'll hand it back to Shane here.
Yep. So, getting the most out of our SIEM, first, we're going to make sure that it's installed and configured correctly. Were best practices followed with the device? Do we have enough storage? Are we retaining the logs long enough? Do we have the right filters installed to receive the data and normalize it from our various devices and systems? Things like that. The next thing we want to do is we want to ensure that all of our devices and systems are set to log to the SIEM, not just critical ones, right? Because events don't necessarily start on the critical devices. They come from an end user clicking on a phishing message, right? And it may start there. So we want to ensure that we're logging from our servers, our network devices, workstations, antivirus software, DLP systems, anything that in our system that can send a log stream, we want it logging to the SIEM so we can correlate those events. What this also enables us to do too, and should be part of our governance plan, is validating that current asset inventory against the SIEM. We know we should always be, checking our asset inventories and making sure that we know what's on our network and that everything's patched, it got AV. But we also want to make sure that they're logging to the SIEM as part of this process. And this is going to help us ensure that new devices are added as they're brought into our environment.
And just one thing to add there, when we walk into a lot of credit unions, a lot of times it's a cost. I mean, having a SIEM is expensive. Expensive hardware requires a ton of storage, and then depending on your solution, it's often license-based. A lot of credit unions choose to reduce the prioritization of workstations. But if you look at how breaches kind of evolve, they usually start with end users, and they're going to be at some workstation level. So we see often that is not applied to workstations, but it is a really important part of your SIEM solution to include those workstations.
All right. So next, we want to ensure that it's tuned appropriately. So we want to make sure that our alerting and monitoring rules are set. Are we actually alerting on the things that we want to? Is the SIEM looking at the right pieces of data? We want to ensure that those correlation rules are set up correctly. All SIEMs, or most SIEMs should come with, a standard set of correlation rules, but those can be expanded upon. So do we know that these events are related and that we should be looking for them? The other thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we continually tune those alerts so that we avoid alert fatigue. Those of you that have been in, that are part of IT teams, alerting can, take over your life. And a SIEM, tuned the wrong way will alert on every little thing. So we need to make sure that we're setting those thresholds, that we don't necessarily want to know about every failed logon, but if we get 20 failed logons, that might be something, a threshold that we want to alert on depending on our environment. So constantly looking at this and refining it is the way to make sure that it's A, operating for us and giving us the data we need, but B, not affecting our day-to-day operations. So we want to make sure that we're reviewing that reporting. All of our SIEMs, one of the core functionalities is to enable us to report on the environment. So we want to make sure that we are, producing regular reports, daily, weekly, monthly, to, look for anomalies that may have been missed on an individual basis. If we sometimes looking at a failed login report, if you look at penetration tests, when they do low and slow, just trying to brute force things, over a period of time, you might not hit those thresholds, but looking at a report back over the last week, you can see some of these data, and then we can kind of tool tune our rules. Again, the events that the rules missed, those sorts of things. We're looking for those types of scenarios. Validating privilege use. Most of your SIEMs are going to be able to monitor privileged account usage. So do we know what our administrator accounts are doing? And if we see things that shouldn't be happening, that could either be an outside breach or someone, exceeding the privileges that they should be using, and it helps us identify those. We want to use those reports, like I said earlier, to tune the alerting and the rules. And we want to make sure that whoever is responsible for reviewing these are actually reviewing them, and that we're documenting those reviews accordingly. As we go through our governance plans and, to ensure that our information security program is being followed, we always want to record that these actions are happening.
Yeah, and that's a good security posture, but also whether it's an internal audit, the third party, or the NCOA, they come in, it's great that you have a SIEM, show me a report, and the next step is, all right, give me one example of how you actioned a report. So it is a fair and reasonable question you'll get from most auditors or examiners.
Yep. So next, we want to ensure we assign appropriate resources. Again, a SIEM requires attention. It needs, someone with SIEM expertise and preferably training on the particular SIEM that is operating in your environment. That person needs to be reviewing the alerts, making sure that the alerts are valid and that we're not missing alerts that should be fired, and that they're being sent to the appropriate people. We need to ensure that someone, both the person running the SIEM and oversight, are reviewing those reports. Is it operating as expected? Are we seeing upticks in events that might indicate indicate an issue, or are we missing devices, right? And then that person needs to, we need to have someone that's, tuning the SIEM on a regular basis to make sure that it's accounting for new devices, new systems, and new threats, and that we're identifying those. So here's our slide. A SIEM needs love and attention. It's not a set it and forget it solution. So this, just like most things in management and IT, we've got to have that continuous feedback loop. All right, we've set it up, now we're monitoring it, it needs to be tuned, and we want to make sure that we've got that cycle going with the SIEM like we do with our other systems. So one thing we want to consider is, should you outsource the SIEM management and monitoring? A number of folks and credit unions like to keep it in-house and run them themselves, and we've seen a number of folks, outsource it. Some of the benefits of outsourcing is you get a 24/7 monitoring, through a SOC of engineers and analysts. Those firms that you're going to outsource to should have expertise in that SIEM that you are running and be able to provide that tuning, that reporting, make sure that the data is being normalized correctly and that we're capturing all the data. And then, ultimately that frees up your credit union staff to be able to serve the members better, right? So that we can do members, serving systems, ensure the rest of our environment where we may have more expertise is in line, and leave the SIEM, management to the folks that have that specialized training.
And just one thing to add that, so even if you outsource, right, and there's often a belief, well, we've outsourced it, so we don't have to staff it. Even if you outsource it, you absolutely have to staff it, making sure that you're having the appropriate devices, that the moves, adds, change are getting accounted for, and you're managing the inventory appropriately. And outsourcing still requires management.
Yes, and you still need to make sure that you, as the credit union management and staff, are monitoring those, reviewing those reports, and ensuring that your alerting is coming in. So, yes. All right. So what can you do right now? For those of you that answered the poll that you don't have a SIEM, now's the time to get one. It's, this is one of the ways that we can ensure that we're or not ensure, but helps us get visibility across our environment. It's an important tool in our arsenal to protect our members. Ensure your SIEM is configured correctly. Do we have enough storage? Are we keeping, events long enough? Do we have all of our devices, logging to our SIEM? Let's reconcile it against our asset and system inventory. Make sure that you're getting the reports you need. Has a review been done to see what's, what reports are being received and what reports are available based on that data that will help you do your job and ensure that this, the safety of your environment. And then, who is reviewing them and what are they doing with them? Are they acting on them? Are they just sitting in an inbox, or are we actually recording that we've reviewed those reports and taken action when appropriate? Lastly, we want to make sure that that SIEM is alerting properly. We've seen environments where the SIEM's taking logs from everything, but nobody's getting the alerts, or it's not configured to alert, or there was a bug in the system. So make sure that those alerts are coming. And if you stop seeing them, let's investigate why.
Yeah, and just a few things I'm going to ask Shane just a few questions before we open it up for Q&A. And when we say ensure your SIEM is configured correctly, we're talking about reconciling against some of your other systems. And I think, Shane, the ones a lot of times we walk in and we look at how a SIEM is configured, then we reconcile it against the patching report, make sure which is usually going to have all the workstations and servers and often network devices. AV, as well, then looking against how reports from IVAs and EVAs, because it's very common that people have missed an entire subnet or something that wasn't deemed critical, or the subnets or the network has grown over time and we're not updating the SIEM as we go. For that reason, when you're creating your governance plan around, hey, what do we do with SIEM alerts? What do we do with reports? What's the frequency? To do an actual SIEM configuration review quarterly is a really good practice to be in, because there's a lot of changes that happen a quarter. Branches open, branches close, office moves, new network devices are deployed, etc. So you really want to get into a healthy habit of that reconciliation. It's probably the best way to make sure you're capturing all of your devices. And now some SIEMs will have kind of auto discover, which are great. Many do not, but there's almost always still some human element to make sure that it knows where to look. And also is alerting properly. They have out of the box, alert profiles of different criticalities. Make sure that you are leveraging that and it aligns with your policies as a credit union. So what's low, medium, high, critical, etc., because those are treated differently. And a lot of times Shane talked about noise, but if you have the right classifications and categorization on these events, you want to make sure you're always giving the appropriate amount of attention to these. So just wanted to add those in as well.
Yeah, and just jumping back one more time on is everything alerting to it? Think about those new systems. If they have syslog settings or logging settings, make sure that we're sending that data there. Things like your web filtering appliances, your VPN concentrators, IDS, IPS systems. Most of those can all log to your SIEM and probably should be in your environment so that we're getting the appropriate alerting. So. All right, and I think with that, we're now at the Q&A session.
Yeah, so please go ahead if you have any questions, just go ahead and type those in the question section, and we can go ahead and relay them over to Shane. On the other side, if you want to just ask your question, I can unmute you if you raise your hand, and then and you can ask Shane and John directly. All right, so we have the first one coming in, guys. So does OGO have a preferred SIEM?
So from the CISO team, when we work with customers, we are vendor agnostic. We will work with credit unions that have SIEMs across all providers. That being said, one of the products that OGO has offered to some of its customers through a managed SIEM provider is Alien Vault SIEM. But that's a very good SIEM, but there's also other good SIEMs out there. But when we work with folks, we work with them on the best one for their environment. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, John.
No, that's perfect. Yeah. So on the ongoing operations side, yeah, we have a partnership with a Alien Vault provider, which I think is a good SIEM. A lot of it comes down to your individual environment, how many branches you have, and we'll maybe leave for the end. There's also the ongoing as, hey, a few years ago, this was very much an on-prem solution that needs to be on-prem at your headquarters or in your data center, and that's evolved. And we're seeing more credit unions evaluate: do I do SIEM in the cloud versus on-prem? And there's some pros and cons, and maybe we'll cover that topic last.
And do we have any more questions, guys?
Might jump into that on-prem versus SIEM in the cloud, which has become a more popular. So as more folks have been putting more of a footprint in Azure and AWS, which credit unions have been slow to adopt, but are slowly starting to, there is a lot of SIEM providers have really made a cloud-based solution. A lot of the popular misconception is that solution is really for people who have their infrastructure in the cloud, and that's actually not the case. It's just basically the SIEM server that collects everything is sitting in AWS or Azure, and there's a lot of pros and cons to that. The biggest challenge we see with that is that how you calculate the cost of it. A lot of times when you buy on-prem, you're often buying licensing and you're thinking about the number of devices. And when you buy in the cloud, often it's really events per second and how much storage do you require? And you have to evaluate for your credit union, hey, if I have to have all of my branches communicating to this, does that change my bandwidth requirements? What's the best way for them to communicate? How many firewall rules do I need to open up and lock down for, to do this securely? But usually where we see credit union challenges, it's actually hard to estimate what your cost is going to be, because it's often storage based, which is a really complicated equation of, how many devices, events per second. So it's somewhat, you kind of have to start the process to really firm up what the cost is going to be, which is a very prohibitive approach to a kind of a budget focused institution such as a credit union. But it's not necessarily wrong. We've seen a few people go that way, and it can be deployed very effectively, effectively that way. There's also, the advantage that, it is offsite. So if there's some, horrible thing happening locally, that you've got all of your log data at a different location. But we see more and more credit unions evaluating that. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that. There's two effective ways, whether on-prem or a hosted SIEM. And I don't know, Shane, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you covered it effectively, John.
Yeah. All right. And so, Amy, did any more questions come in from the audience?
I'm not seeing any additional questions, but we do have a couple minutes if anyone has any. Again, feel free to just hit the raise your hand button too if you just want to ask them, in person rather than typing in. But if any come up later that you guys think of, please feel free to reach out. If you have either Shane or John's direct contact information, or you can always email info@ongoingoperations.com, and we can pass those questions along to John, Shane, and our information security team. And let's see. And I think that's it from you guys. So thank you all very much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Lattes and Learning webinar.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.